I am Kalinda Eaton, Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. I am also on the Executive Committee of the African Studies Institute and very pleased to host this webinar today. We have with us Mr. Sètondji Roland Adjovi, who is an international law specialist from Benin, West Africa. From 2014 to 2020, he was a human rights expert for the United Nations Human Rights Council in the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. During that time, he was a sought-after instructor in France and Tanzania and held the position of Assistant Professor of Political Studies at Arcadia University in Pennsylvania. For many years, Mr. Adjovi was also the site director of the Tanzania campus of Arcadia's College of Global Studies. Recently, he has been a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in West and East Africa. In this role, he coordinates simulated trials for prosecutors in maritime crimes. Alongside his work for the United Nations, he runs a legal practice specializing in human rights and sports law. Outside of his professional work and human rights activism, on a personal level, Mr. Adjovi's efforts to connect descendants of slavery in the African diaspora back to the continent should be noted. He has also published writing on the need to repatriate cultural artifacts transferred out of Africa between the years 1400 and 1960, and considers the return of such items, quote, the only valid reparation for the unlawful transfers, end quote. Today, he will be speaking to us about how human rights issues are an important part of understanding how local communities and governments address coups and other radical changes of power in select African countries. Please join me in welcoming Sètondji Roland Adjovi. And I know we cannot see you, but I know you were there. So the silent applause is all around. And also throughout the talk, if you have questions, please utilize the Q&A function that you see down in the bottom of your screen. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of this talk. Welcome, Mr. Adjovi.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. I often tell people how I don't recognize myself in any presentation made about me. So today, I want to talk about human rights in Africa in connection to the coup. And there are 6 elements of my presentation. First, I will address the conceptual framework. What are the issues we are going to look at? And provide some basic definition which are going to help us throughout. Then I will identify the specific military coup I'm referring to and explain why those coups happen. Then I will address the issue of prohibition of military coup in Africa. That's a specific rule of international law in Africa. And I will explain where the rule comes from and why the rule is there. Then the specific coup I have identified will look at how internally and externally one had reacted to the coup in understanding the prohibition of the coup. Then we'll look at how the international reaction, in my view, have failed to address the totality of the human rights issue in those countries. And I will address a few issues in the conclusion to sum up my idea on this topic of the human rights and the military coup in Africa. In terms of the conceptual framework, I want to make sure that we are speaking of the same thing. A military coup, it's an overturn of the government by military officers. It's military member of the army who will take power, remove whoever is in power, and take over and rule the country. That has to be distinguished from other type of coup You can have a constitutional coup, you can have a civilian coup, you can have a mix of military and civilian coup. The constitutional coup are interesting because you can make change in the constitution which allowed specific individual to be in power. And that's a constitutional coup. What I want to address here, it's exclusively the military coup and recent military coups. When we talk about human rights, we are talking about rights related to the fact that we are human beings, that those rights are attached to human beings for the mere fact that they are human beings. These rights are fundamental in our modern society. They can vary depending on the society we are living in, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist everywhere. They are the same rights everywhere, but based on the level of development, some rights might take precedence on others. But those are the rights I want to look at. So when I'm talking about human rights, it's those rights which are universal as they apply on the continent in Africa. Of course, the African continent, we all know what we are referring to. It's the geographically isolated piece of land called Africa. No matter what is the divide internally, and more specifically, I want to look at West Africa because the three coups I'm interested in this presentation all occurred in West Africa. And in West Africa, there is a regional organization called Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which is an integration body. It's an organization which has as aim to become an international, a federation of states one day. So let's move to the second slide, which will provide the ground for the military coup I'm referring to. Here, we are talking about country in West Africa, three specific countries. I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, you can stop there. We are talking about three specific countries. You have Mali, which is in the white part of the map on top. You have Mali. We are talking about Guinea, which is on the left side, on the west, under Senegal and Gambia, but connected to Mali. And then we are talking about Burkina Faso, which is just below Mali. Those are the three countries we are concerned about in this presentation. We can move to the next slide. The first country is Mali, where in August 2020, you have a first military coup where they remove an elected president. We could say democratically elected president because there was an election. Only part of the country could participate in the election. We'll come back to it. But there was an election and the president was overturned. And in the new regime, the military regime in place, they put in place a transition, appointed a civilian as head of state. But for some reason, after 6 months, those same military officers did a second coup on the 24th May 2021, overturning the civilian ruler they put as head of the transition. And that's the second coup I will be interested in here. And what you have, the reason for the coup in Mali, the first reason is that in Mali, you have an armed rebellion occupying half of the country. So if we go back to the map on the third slide or the fourth slide where you have the ECOWAS countries, yes. So everything from where Mali is written on the map up to the north was occupied by an armed rebellion. These people feel not taken into account in the way the government is run, in the way the country is run. in the way economic resources are redistributed in the country. But you have also a terrorist organization developing from the northern part, from Libya, Algeria, and Mali, coming to Mali. And the armed rebellion and the terrorists associated themselves to have a united front against the government. And that jeopardized the ability of the government to control the country. So when I refer to the election didn't take into account all this northern part of the country. Mali has an exceptional resource, uranium, which is produced essentially in the northern part. So people in the northern part know that they have a natural resource which should make the country rich, but they are not seeing the benefit of that natural resource. It means the social economic rights are not being respected in this framework. So the coup you have, the initial coup in August 2020, overturned a corrupt government which was not doing anything to fight the armed rebellion in the north or the terrorist expansion in the country. And the second coup made the same argument that the transition put in place and forced into by the international community will not do anything good to the country because they are still failing to fight the rebellion, and the military decide to take over. And interestingly, this new coup, the military asked for 5 years to redress, to reorganize the country and take over the totality of the country and fight successfully the rebellion. We'll see what the reaction to that coup will be later on. So we can go back to the next slide. In Guinea, you have a coup in September 2021. This coup will overturn an elected government. But there is something special with that elected government. The president who was in place initially could only do 2 terms. He proceeded for a constitutional revision, which will allow him to have a 3rd term. So that's a constitutional coup, as I defined it earlier. And it's after that constitutional coup that the military decided to overturn it. Guinea also has a natural resource, iron, on a huge part of its lands, and the contract related to this iron has been extraordinary. And there are several instances of corruption vis-a-vis the concession of the production, the extraction of this iron throughout the country. And the regime in place was taking advantage of it, and the rulers became very rich, even though they don't have any background of wealth we could have seen before. It's only when they came to power that they became rich. So you have a regime, I call it kleptocracy, where you have an elite, a political elite, taking advantage of the natural resource to make it personal wealth and expanding the term, changing the constitution to remain in power as long as possible. And the military intervened to remove them, to take over, and plan to do things better. We will see. We don't know yet if they will succeed. So that's the second military coup we will be referring to. And the third one is in Burkina Faso. Here, you also have several natural resources, oil, gas, gold, and also uranium. And a government which control only part of the country because there is a terrorist group which control half of the other part of the country. And the government has been incapable of addressing the terrorist rebellion or the terrorist insurgents within the country, to the extent that the military who are at the front fighting the terrorists About 2 weeks before the coup, there was a military camp where they wrote to the government and said they have nothing to eat and they are forced to go hunting to feed themselves. And the government did not even react to the statement made by this military officer from the barrack. So you have a coup here also overturning a corrupt government, a kleptocratic government, and dismissing the general of the army as not able to address the terrorist insurgency, and middle rank military officer took power to address the situation. It's interesting that all these coups are happening in West Africa because for many years, international community had considered that West Africa was the most stable part politically and democratically in Africa, and all these coups are happening one after the other. And these 3 coups I'm referring to are the successful coups, which I will look at specifically in my analysis. But there have been other coups during the same period, 2020, 2021. You had a coup which happened in Chad, where the president was killed at war and his son took over, who is also a military man. They didn't allow the transition as it was planned in the constitution, but they took over. In Sudan, you had also 2 consecutive military coups. Those 2 coups in Chad and Sudan were successful, but I'm not going to address them in my analysis, even though some of the points I'll make are equally valid for them. Then you have 2 other coups which fail. It means military tried to overturn the regime, but they were not successful in the coup and the regime remained in place. It's in Niger. Niger, if you look at the map, you'll see it's also close to Mali and Burkina Faso, and also suffer from the same terrorist organization. And then you have Guinea-Bissau, which is a tiny country at the bottom on the left, which is a Portuguese-speaking country and a country which has been seriously impacted by a drug trafficking cartel. And the current president tried to stop the drug trafficking business, and the military who controlled the drug trafficking were not happy and wanted to overturn him to keep power. So those situations are very specific, and that's why I removed them from my analysis, but some of the elements could be equally valid, and we could talk about it if times permit. We'll move to the next slide about the prohibition of military coup. So in Africa, you have several rules which prohibit the military coup in the political arena completely. The first is circumstantial and historical. It's the end of the Cold War. It's important because before the end of the Cold War, Western countries have been associated to military coup in Africa, and they will overturn regimes which do not serve their interests and will support the military to do a coup here and there. With the end of the Cold War, democratization has been better promoted, and as a result, the world has considered that military coup should no longer happen, especially on the continent. So you have a political discourse which no longer promote military coup and encourage state to allow democratic process of transition of power, to allow the people to choose who their rulers are. At the same time, you have human rights principles, human rights norms supporting the rule of law. Rule of law meaning the government is subject to the law is decided by the people, and the people therefore participate in public affairs in their own country. And the existing institutions the government has an obligation to respect the constitutional framework in place. So that's how human rights have an influence on determining the prohibition, on setting up the prohibition of military coups. But you have specific rules, international norms within the African context, which will expressly prohibit military coup. Not only military coup, all coup. In fact, the current international organization in Africa, which encompasses all African states, it's called the African Union. The treaty which created that organization was adopted in Lomé in 2000. It's called the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Article 4P expressly states the principle that all unconstitutional change of government are condemned and rejected. It means within the African Union context, nobody will tolerate unconstitutional change of government. As you can see, unconstitutional change of government, it's not only military coup. It's any change of government which does not follow what is in the constitution. Question, if one changed the constitution to allow a certain ruler to be in place, is it unconstitutional change of government? That's an issue we leave on the side. But anytime there is a change of government, which is not what the constitution had planned, that is an unconstitutional change of government, which is prohibited in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. So any member state of the African Union should not embark on any unconstitutional change of government. So that's the prohibition. Then they went further to adopt what is called the Malabo Protocol. It's another treaty adopted in 2014 in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea, where they adopt a statute for the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And that court has a jurisdiction, a criminal jurisdiction. And one of the crimes within its jurisdiction, it's the unconstitutional change of government, which is considered as a crime. So it's not only prohibited, it's now criminalized or penalized as you want. It means anyone who gets involved in an unconstitutional change of government can be prosecuted and sentenced to prison time for having committed a crime in the African context. Again, this is very specific to the African context. And if you read the Malabo Protocol, there are 14 different crimes. So you have the general, the ordinary international crime, genocide, crime against humanity, war crime, but you have some crimes which are specific. So you have here the unconstitutional change of government, but corruption is also a crime which can be prosecuted. On top of those two instruments, the Constitutive Act and the Malabo Protocol, numerous human rights instruments have stated the same, that any regime in Africa should be in place only through what is provided in the Constitution, in compliance with the Constitution only. And we have a specific treaty on democracy and election, which provide in detail how elections should be organized, why there should be a multi-party election. And that allowed me to say what was done in Guinea, changing the constitution to allow a certain ruler to extend the mandate, is unconstitutional. So you have a very rich normative framework in Africa about coup, all coup, including the military coup. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, let's look at how one has reacted to these three coups I mentioned. First, the condemnation of the coup because of this legal framework I have mentioned, and because of the political dynamic worldwide, that no coup should be accepted. As the coup is condemned, of course, you need to take measure to force the military junta in place to come back to a system acceptable. So sanctions are put in place against the military regime. And those sanctions are no more trade with the country. Sometimes they close the bank account of the country. They prohibit every financial transaction with the country as it's done now with Russia vis-a-vis the aggression in Ukraine. So you have those sanctions affecting how the government will function with the aim of preventing the government to have the means to subsist. So if they cannot remain in place because they don't have money, the economy is down, they will move to a transition with civilian ruler. Then in most instances, there is a request for the shortest transition, less than a year, okay, so that they will have election and a new elected, democratically elected regime in place. It has not been successful, and we'll see why. And the way the condemnation, the sanction, and the dialogue has worked until now is that the sub-regional body, ECOWAS, will take the first step, and the leader of ECOWAS country will meet, excluding the country where there is a coup, because one of the sanctions is you are suspended to take part in the decision-making process within ECOWAS. So the remaining of the states will make a decision about that country, and whatever they decide will be endorsed by the African Union, which is the continental organization. And if they are successful enough, it will be endorsed again by the Security Council to give it universal blessing. Now, in this specific case, it will not work perfectly well, because in one instance at least, in Mali and in Guinea-Conakry, you have the Russian and the Chinese supporting the military regime somehow. France supports the regime which has been overturned. So China or Russia or both of them have been able to block the blessing within the Security Council, because the new regime in place, the military regime, served their interests, signed contract with them, while France, UK, or the US are seeing their interest in the region, in those countries, diminish. So the blessing of the Security Council has not been automatic, because there is an international dynamic within the Security Council which prevents some of those sanctions to be endorsed. That's the reaction we have outside of the concerned state for each of those three states I mentioned: Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, and Mali. Inside the country, within the country, the population has always rejoiced for the coup. When those coups had happened, people went in the street, demonstrated their support to the military, and expressing how happy they were that the military regime has been, the previous regime has been overturned, and that military have taken over. And expressing the trust in the military to make the situation better. My question is, if people who are subject to the military regime, who are allegedly the victim of the military coup, are happy about the military coup, why is the world unhappy about the military coup? That's why I came with the analysis that the international reaction to this military coup has failed to consider the well-being of these people. We can move to the next slide, and I will explain further. So what we have here is a situation of a corrupt state and a failed state. corrupt because the natural resource, the wealth of the country, is not being redistributed for the benefit of the population. The population's right, social and economic right to development, is not being served by the regime in place. Why should we keep this regime or develop an analysis, a legal framework which allow this regime to remain in place and continue to capture the wealth of the state for individual interests when they fail to serve the interests of the population, of the majority of the population? That corruption is a crime within the African context. Why do we want to put that corruption at a lower level than the unconstitutional change of government which occurred? We need to revisit the hierarchy between the different human rights norms and be able to adjust our understanding, our acceptance of what is happening in those countries. The second element, failed states. You take the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, those two countries specifically. The regime which was in place controlled less than half of the country. And in Mali, it's even only the capital that they really control. They control nothing beyond. But they expose the military throughout the country to confront the armed rebellion and or the terrorist organization. This is a government which does not have a proper control over its territory. Why do we want to protect that government vis-a-vis a government which is interested in regaining control of the totality of the country, and the government, more importantly, which is going to protect the population against an armed rebellion, war, or a terrorist organization, war in a different dimension? So in my view, the condemnation of this military coup failed to take into account the fact that social economic right of these people is being violated by the existing regime, the existing ruler, and nothing is done about it, and failed to address the fact that the government is a failed government which doesn't have control over its territory. These arguments could be misunderstood as a support and encouragement to a military coup. Not at all. The military coup happened. I was not behind, and I'm not interested in being behind. I'm interested in safeguarding human rights. And my question is, the regime existing, does it protect human rights as much as the new regime is going to protect it? I need a dialogue with whoever the ruler is to ensure a better protection of human rights and not embark on a condemnation, a systematic condemnation of any military coup. In short, and this is my conclusion, and we can move to the last slide. In my view, not all military coups are against human rights violation. A military coup might be the revolution which will take us toward a better framework to protect human rights. We need to look at the situation on a case-by-case basis and be able to make a judgment, a decision as to, is this positive? Are we going to gain anything out of it? And move from there. In the three cases I have addressed, I have difficulty condemning the coup, bearing in mind the regime which was in place and how I evaluate those regimes. So this coup, if they are well-framed, well-accompanied, and watch to be forced to respect human rights, we could get a situation which is better than what was in place previously. And in my view, the international reaction, whether it's at the level of ECOWAS, at the African Union, but also at the Security Council, has failed to take into account the interests of the population. And in my view, the military coup, based on the reaction of the population, of the majority of the population, will probably serve better the interests of the population. And we need to reevaluate how we rank these human rights values and make sure that we serve the interests of the population. In conclusion, I don't think that the military coup, the mere fact that a military coup occurred, is going to resolve the social economic crisis in the country and address all those human rights. It's a process, whether it's a democratically elected regime or a military regime. As a human rights activist, we need to watch, we need to criticize, to challenge whoever is there to improve their delivery to the population. But being in a condemnation position does not help us do that. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm open to question and I can explain further if necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking and provocative presentation. There are a couple of questions that have already come through. The first question: why do countries in Africa usually fail to democratize and minimize the culture of coups?
That is a question which will require a long history. So first, as I mentioned earlier, you have a culture until the end of the Cold War, so until 1989 and 1990, where external non-African country, powerful country in the world, especially those 5 permanent members of the Security Council, had used military coup to bring in power people who will serve their interests. I'm from Benin. Benin was well known for military coup in the 60s. We had a regime who stayed for 1 month, for 3 months, and we even had the triumvirate, where people agree at some point, 3 leaders, to share power one after the other. So you have historically an international political framework which encouraged the coup. You also have a sociological element where in the African society, in the African country, the political understanding of the system is not always widespread and well developed. The most organized group, professional group in those countries has always been the military. So if you want a solution to get a regime in place, efficient and blah, 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 you go to the military. So there are civilians who have had interest in seeing the military coming into power. Now, you need to keep in mind also that democratization, it's a social, cultural norm. What you call democracy in the US is not what they call democracy in Canada. It's not what they call democracy in France, in Germany, in Spain or Portugal. African states are developing their own understanding of what democracy means for them. But until people are better educated, have better critical perspective about it, you want to reach a level where everything else anti-democratic will be banned. You still have process in place which will remain anti-democratic. It's a process. You need to let them arrive at that level. Back in the days in the Latin American countries, there were coups all over the place. Today, there are less coups, but you have corrupt regime with drug cartel. So you have a system, a social dynamic, a culture which is not at the same stage, not that it's better or lower. I'm not comparing them in an hierarchy, okay? They are just different. So in the context we are in, yes, there are things which do not sound totally democratic, and there are practices which do not exist elsewhere, but which are not impossible. Recently, there was imagination that there could be military coup in the United States. I was happy I was about to leave. So, but do not think that it's something only in environment where democracy has not been developed or grown. It's possible everywhere. The condition, the circumstance will differ from one place to the other. I hope that addressed the question.
Great, thank you. The next question, are military coups in East Africa aggressive or more aggressive, I guess, and against rights, I guess, in ways that would be more detrimental than, say, in other parts of the country? So it's asking specifically about military coups in East Africa, and it's kind of like anti-human rights or aggressive coups.
East Africa has not had military coup for a while, but you have people who are in power as a result of a military coup. So if you take Uganda, he came through a military coup and later organized election and has been winning election for the last 30 years. So I can't say it's more aggressive. Those military coups which occur in East Africa occurred during the Cold War. So they were more violent, okay? Today, the military coup we are having are not leading to death of a large number of people and so on. You have military coups which are almost without violence because people who are there easily surrender to the new military rulers. In Guinea-Conakry, they have been killing, we still don't know how many people, and they jail people from the regime in place, but they don't kill them. So military coups today are less violent, but you have countries where there is war, and unfortunately, war remains violent.
Okay, more questions. How are you drawing the thin line between looking at coups as negative for the country and between introducing a better framework for human rights?
I'm not drawing a line. My interest is protecting human rights, improving the quality of life of the people. And it can be done within a democratic regime. It can be done within a military ruler. We need a conversation to take the regime to the level we are satisfied with what they are delivering. I am refusing to condemn the military coup because if I refuse to have a dialogue with them, I cannot help them improve the human rights condition. I need an open dialogue with a military ruler. It's not for me to decide whether you should be in power or not. You are in power, it's a fait accompli. I need to have a conversation with you to ensure that whoever you are, wherever you come from, however you came to power, you respect as much as possible your human rights. In Benin, we have a democratically elected regime. Over the last two days, I tweeted to my government because transgender people are being abused in police office, in the police station. And Amnesty International published a report about it. I don't care about the fact that they have been elected democratically. It's just unacceptable. So my issue is not how you came to power. My issue is accompanying the regime, forcing the regime to respect as much as possible. That's my interest.
Okay, more questions. Can you speak to the correlation between the increase of the U.S. Africom presence on the continent and military coups?
The U.S. presence on the continent is related to the expansion of terrorism on the continent. They are here to fight terrorism. Now, are they fighting it for the interests of the African or for their own interests as US? That's a different discourse. The correlation I can see is that expansion is a failure because countries that are fighting terrorism are countries falling into the military coup. At least two of them with successful coup and one with a failed coup. Mali has a US operation. Burkina Faso has a huge US operation. Niger has an extensive US operation, anti-terrorist operation. If those operations were successful, we will have gained stability in those countries, we'll have kicked the terrorists out and have a better regime. But the terrorists are there. It has looked like it's forever because they have been there for the last 5 to 10 years. Since Libya has collapsed, these terrorists have been there and nothing seems to dismantle their organization. So the correlation I see is that expansion is not really successful. Maybe it helped the US military industry to deploy more drones to make more money, but I don't see the positive impact on my people.
There is an expansion to this question, and it says also, could you please feel free to comment on the fact that France has the second most military bases on the African continent? So it's kind of like did you want to add something in there about France in response to that last question?
Yes, that's interesting, but it also have issues from the colonial regime. This country were all colonized by France, and France has developed a close relationship with those countries, those French-speaking countries, and in some instances, they have military base. It's also a failure of that policy of France because despite the military involvement in those countries, they have not been able to prevent what is happening, especially in Mali, where there is a total breakdown. The northern part of the country, you see, has been controlled by France for the last 10 years. I did work for the UN. The airspace is controlled by the French military. You want to fly over Mali, it's a French military which gives you authorization. Yet they have not been able to fight so successfully the terrorists. What is the military deployment for? It's a failure. So yes, it's an element to take into account, but again, the same analysis as the US shows that you are there, but you are not so successful because you have not been able to prevent the failure, the instability in those countries.
Okay, thank you. There are a few more questions here. Do you think the coup in Burkina Faso by Paul-Henri Damiba was somehow connected to the previous president,
Blaise Compaoré.
Compaoré, thank you, I can't see that.
So that would be a speculation from my part. I have no information to state that it's connected. He see interest in it. Blaise Compaoré was the president before. He was overturned. He left the country, resided in Côte d'Ivoire. Is prosecuted in the death of the previous president Sankara, and doesn't want to come back home because he feared the prosecution. He has embarked on a negotiation with the government to come back, and it seems that the new military regime in place is favorable to allow him to come back. So there is a connection, there is a reason to believe that he had interest in the successful military coup. But I have no information to make that statement, unfortunately, and it will not be fair to speculate.
Okay. This is a kind of a two-part question. So I'll read the whole thing and then let me know if you need me to clarify. What role might the development of political culture play in the effort to keep at bay the tendency for unconstitutional forms of political change like coups. Does the culture working the military, for example, its ethnic makeup, like the ethnic makeup of the military, does that come into play at all in terms of the tendency for unconstitutional forms of political change?
The ethnic composition of the military, not an element in my view, unless the regime in place was discriminatory against the group which is the majority within the army. That will be something we have seen before the end of the Cold War. But what you have today, it's a culture, a political culture, which still allowed military coup to have a significance, to have an impact, and to present an interest for the population. People don't see any other democratic avenue to make the change. You have a democratically elected president who doesn't care about you, who is drinking champagne every day, eating foie gras, eating everything imported from the Western country, where the military is starving. What other avenue do you have to get rid of him? Can you file a case in the Constitutional Court to get him dismissed for failing his population? How the democratic, non-violent avenue work? If they don't work, people have no other choice than moving to a violent avenue. And in my view, that culture is what is essential. And as I stated earlier, the more political culture will develop in the African context, and the stronger institution you have to safeguard those non-violent avenues for political change, the less interest we'll see in the military coup. But until then, I have no other solution. If I had a pill, I would have given either to the ruler to accept to quit on his own, or to the judge to convict the ruler for treason, so that we have a non-violent change of government. But unfortunately, we have not produced those pills yet. So until then, we will still suffer few coups here and there as the situation allows.
Okay, I see two more questions, and I know we have about 5 minutes left in the webinar. So the next question is, what is your take on the Russian mercenaries, more specifically the Wagner Group?
So it's very interesting because you have non-African states, powerful states, having military presence of different form in Africa. Having a mercenary group is nothing new. During the Cold War, countries have used mercenary all over. French had mercenary who they pay, facilitated to do military coup in Africa. The US has supported some mercenaries or supported proxy wars in other countries. The Russians are doing what the Western countries have done for many years, okay? The interesting part is the fallout with Western countries, especially with France, leads to a military vacuum, which the Russians have managed to fill. Now, my personal take is you are still within external forces manipulating you. When are you going to be on your own? Because whether it's military from France, from China, from US, from Russia, or I don't know which other country tomorrow, before Cuba had military intervene in Angola. But Cuba is separate, I have to admit. All those countries deploy military for their own interests. And you have to bear that in mind. Whether you dismiss the French military today, sign up with Russian military, don't worry. France was seeing its interest before. Now Russia will see its interest served. And your interest will be the last one. it's only when you take your own responsibility and take care of yourself that things will be different. So in my view, going for a Russian military or a security group, whatever you call it, or to France, it's the same business. You change the nationality, you are still the servant of someone. Now, talking about mercenary, the concept is very specific. Why don't we say it's a private military company, private security company? The US has been using them worldwide, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, all over the place. Do we call them mercenaries? Let's use the same concept for all of them. And I dismiss them all. We should not be having them. Full stop.
Okay. The last question here. Don't military regimes threaten more readily to collapse into authoritarian, repressive forms of rule than do democratic ones, even though the democratic ones may be problematic?
That's a theorem, a principle which I will not be able to state because experience has shown differently. I'm from Benin. We had a military ruler for 17 years, 18 years. He accepted to shift to a democratically elected regime on his own without any violence. We had in Guinea-Conakry a democratically elected regime which changed the constitution against the will of the people to remain in power forever. Which one is the best? I have no idea. Again, I want to have a conversation on a case-by-case basis. Say whoever the ruler is there, how much value is he given to human rights? How much dialogue can I have to increase the protection of individuals within that regime? That's the conversation I want to have. I don't want to make that judgment, which is very circumstantial.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, Mr. Adjovi. We are all the more enlightened and informed as a result of your presentation. I'm very glad that you had the opportunity to speak to the African Studies Institute. We've been talking about trying to get you, first it was before COVID to actually get you here in person, and also then after that to get you on Zoom. So I'm happy that you were able to speak to us. You have presented a lot of, as I mentioned before, very thought-provoking ideas. And I think these conversations will continue on long after this talk. As you said in the end, you want to have the conversation. And I think we all can agree that these conversations do need to happen. So even though, again, you can't see the rest of the participants, I'm sure everyone is giving you a round of applause there. And I hope these conversations continue on. Thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar, and have a wonderful week.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.